So while Jeanette is figuring that out, hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Mathis, my pronouns are she, they, and I am the Central Florida Climate Justice Organizer. There I am. I am the Central Florida Climate Justice Organizer with Florida Rising. Before I introduce our incredible panelists, I am going to be issuing a land acknowledgement. Prior to beginning our panel, it is our practice to issue an acknowledgement that the land which the state of Florida occupies is the rightful indigenous land of the Native peoples of America, the Seminole, the Miccosukee, the Creek, Ais, Appalachee, Yamasee, Timucua, Tequesta, and the tribe we call Calusa. This land is theirs, it is sacred, and it is the duty of every person who occupies this space to respect it and seek to redress the foundational injustice which established this polity. I would like to further acknowledge that the state of Florida, which we seek to transform the policies of, has been built in large part on the coerced and unrewarded labor of people of color, enslaved Africans and their descendants, and migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean. The alienation of Native peoples from their land and the people of color from the fruits of their labor is not a historical tragedy, but an ongoing injustice which we must seek to redress. The climate crisis and the impacts it will have on Indigenous peoples, Black people, and people of color is merely another manifestation of these ongoing injustices. As we conduct our business here today, I implore the participants and attendees to place the necessity for restorative justice at the front of their minds. So I want to, can you guys hear me? Am I being quiet? I will try and speak louder, Dina, I'm so sorry. So I want to introduce our panelists for this evening because I am super excited about both of them. So first we have Nahomi. Nahomi Matos Rondón was born in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, but raised in Carrizales, Saltillo until the age of 10. She and her family moved to Hollywood, Florida in 2006 due to the worsening economic conditions and lack of opportunities on the island. Nahomi was immediately introduced to community work via after-school and seasonal camp programs in which she participated, volunteered, and worked up until 2019. She graduated from FIU in 2018 with a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations, a minor in sociology and anthropology, and certifications in queer studies, Brazilian culture and Portuguese language, and Latin American and Caribbean studies. Along with communal work, Nahomi has delved into qualitative analysis and has participated in national as well as international research projects through departments such as the Robert Stempel College of Public Health and Social Work and the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. Nahomi's organizing work emphasizes the importance of bringing about a multidimensional lens of what it means to be an individual in a frontline community during our current climate crisis. Our next panelist is Joanne Peredin. Joanne grew up in Haiti and is a public health scientist whose work focuses on the interlinkages between climate, community health, social, and racial equity. She currently oversees the climate justice program at Florida Rising, which means she is my incredible boss, which is a pupil-powered organization made up of members advancing economic and racial justice throughout Florida. Her work currently focuses on environmental justice, food insecurity, disaster resilience, and clean and renewable energy. Before joining Florida Rising, Joanne worked in Washington, D.C. on environmental health policy and international public policy, collaborating with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Department of Health and Human Services, the United States Agency for International Development, Department of Defense, and the World Health Organization. She is the Miami Climate Alliance Disaster Resilience Working Group Chair, a Climate Power 2020 Florida State Co-Chair, a Delta Omega Public Health Honorary Society member, a recipient of the Top 20 Under 40 Top Young Haitian American Professionals and South Florida 40 Under 40 Award. She holds a Master's of Public Health and Environmental Health from the University of Maryland School of Public Health, and is currently a public administration doctoral student at the Florida International University School of Public Affairs. So now that you guys know a little bit of how incredible these two people are, I am going to ask them to come off of mute, and I'm going to ask our first question. For those of you who have joined us for the first two nights of the summit, tonight's going to look a little different. We aren't going to have any slides. We're actually just going to be having a conversation. So between Naomi and Joanne, we are going to be talking about just recovery. So my first question then is for both of you, and y'all can decide who wants to go first. What does just recovery mean to you?
Okay, I'll give it a try first. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be sharing this space for you, with you. And I also want to thank the organizers of this amazing Climate Justice Summit. When it comes to how I would define just recovery, I think there's not a single definition because it's a complex concept or framework. And coming from an equitable or social justice lens, in my opinion, I would refer to just recovery as a framework that looks into just not immediate response relief following a disaster, but also the recovery process. So how do we get back to a better position so that we have a more solid foundation when facing future disasters? But how do we also approach disaster management that would include all the different phases that would fall within disasters? However, when we look at the historical context on how communities have been impacted, not everyone is impacted the same way when it comes to disasters, and not everyone receives the relief that they need based on the impact that any given disaster has had on their communities. And here in the state of Florida, we are in Hurricane Alley, and I'm sure many of us on this call have seen the disparities when it comes to disaster response. Unfortunately, when we think about Black communities, when we think about Indigenous communities, when we think about communities of people of color, unfortunately, we are the last, or at the bottom of the list when it comes to having access to relief, especially within the first 72 hours following a disaster. So I think when we are talking about just recovery, it's not only, or it should not only include the some of those critical phases of disasters, but the role that communities have played as first responders within their first communities, and the extent of work that is still needed when it comes to approaching that framework from an equitable lens.
Sorry, they were about to feed the dog and there was a lot of bag rustling. Can you guys hear me okay? Cool. Along with the practical and the historical component that Joanne just touched on, I think that I not only do I agree, but added on to that is the international lens that needs to be inputted into that analysis. Climate change isn't something that's isolated to the communities that we are present in, but also the places that we have come from. And being that the US is one of the biggest extractivist economies, and also the ones that really consume and dump the most, there is sort of like that responsibility to really check what our patterns are regarding these conducts and the way that it impacts outside of here. So it's that, and for me also that component of like, where is this going and who else is impacted that does not have a seat readily at the table, whether it be because of language, ability, class, race, etc. Because it is very true that giving the identity, you get impacted differently. As far as just recovery, it very much has to deal with like, how is the community sort of like dealing from, it sort of seems like we're going from disaster to disaster to disaster. So where is that intervention where it's just dealing with the climate event and not a disaster? Because the disaster is very much informed by the context in which the event like sort of goes in towards. If you have lack of infrastructure, if you have all of these like factors that are not dealt with at the time that they should be dealt with, you're going to see it be exacerbated once the events come in. So yeah, yes.
So then, extending that kind of glossary that we're doing right now, because in the climate justice movement, we hear a lot of words kind of thrown around. And I know, Joanne, you mentioned there's a lot of things that these words can mean to different people, different communities. But specifically to you guys and to Florida at large, in addition to just recovery, one of the words we hear a lot is resilience. So can you guys talk just a little bit, Naomi, I see your face, just talk a little bit about, the ways in which you guys have used those words and the ways in which maybe that let me just stop there. So yeah, the ways that you guys understand the word resilience in relation to just recovery.
Okay. All right. So I have a very tumultuous relationship with the word resiliency, just because I feel like our community, specifically the communities that we serve within the Florida Immigrant Coalition and the members that are holding space, off the rip, the institutions are not responsive to the same manner that they are to other communities. So they are sort of like taking in the helm and the responsibility of the first responder sort of duty that these institutions that they're supposed to be I guess, taking care of them, they're not present. So resiliency, sometimes, it's sort of like a cop out in the sense of we're already picking up the broken plates. So now there's just a word for it. Ideally, that shouldn't be the only way that things get done. And as far as Florida, like we know that there are power dynamics. Brickell gets power first before places like Liberty City, Overtown, Opelika, Little Haiti. So you see the cleanup efforts look differently. Who does that? And that's where I feel like people drop the ball, and the ones who have to pick it up is always community. So that's where the term resiliency is like, so, yeah.
I would say for me, I would categorize the term resilience into two main categories. But oftentimes when we are in spaces talking about climate change or the climate crisis, we tend to hear resilience being, okay, a disaster hit, how quickly are you able to bounce back? But when we think about communities that are every day dealing with disasters, whether it be from an economic standpoint, whether it be from housing security or food security, the fact that those families or those communities are still alive today speaks to the cultural component and some of the other factors that they bring to the space or from their environment that has allowed them to sustain given the circumstances that they're under. Now, going back to the two categories or definition that I would use for resilience, the first one, I think it's been an evolving definition. So when we think about it in an environmental context, is, if there has been an instability, how quickly are you able to bounce back? But if we also look at that term from a psychological description, with the trauma that many families, communities are dealing with, how are they managing to survive and function? And to me, that's another definition of resilience. Now, that second category, in my opinion, is seeing resilience as a process or a function that joins our ecosystem or the ecological environment that we're in and the structural component of our environment. So if we're talking about a hurricane, for example, we do know that with hurricanes comes flooding, comes destructions of homes. But we also know with hurricanes come like psychological trauma, comes like lived experiences, or how some communities are able to utilize or incorporate their cultural values and how they're able to survive or withstand any given disasters. So when we think about resilience from a functional or as a function, how do like the infrastructure in terms of buildings merges with those lived experiences. But I also think there should be a revised definition of infrastructure. If we reflect back on the COVID-19 pandemic, when we think about our frontline workers, I think that group of individuals should be seen as an infrastructure, not necessarily as a building, but a part of our community that has allowed us to be where we are now, because without them, we would have not had access to going to the grocery store and having supplies or produce on the shelves. It's thanks to those frontline workers. If we didn't have farm workers that sacrificed their time and that risked their life to make sure that food was delivered and put on our table, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I think frontline workers, for example, should also be seen as a critical infrastructure in our community.
That's awesome. So my next question, and this is, Naomi, what you were saying about your kind of tumultuous relationship with the word resilient and resiliency. So if we're looking at kind of what resilience could be, the way in which that we would define a just and equitable resilience, what is it that you see Florida needing to work on the most in order to get there? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Community first, I think that we really need to address the longitudinal gap in development that because it is stark. Like if you go to different areas, you see how much progress they've had according to like the privileges and ability to just maneuver these systems properly or efficiently due to having advantages. So since we are very much already doing the work, I feel like they need to have a more prominent way to access the resources and the space to get things done. And it's I think it's a very short and simple answer to it. I don't think that there's like a lot of fuss around it. But that very much has to deal with the fact that there is a racialized lens as far as like who's doing this work, how is this work supposed to look, what is the purpose and to what end. And in order for community to be put first, they would need to reimagine what is the purpose of the entire system, whether it be the infrastructure, whether it be the energy, whether it be even the idea of schooling, because we're not always trying to pick up the pieces. There needs to be a point where we're not just mitigating, we're just attacking stuff from the root. So having individuals that are actively out here creating mutual aid systems, creating direct aid, redistributing income, and having all kinds of alternative ways to redistribute resources within the community, it needs to be taken more into consideration because it at the level that we're going as far as consumption and waste production, it's not sustainable. And it could be a local approach. It's just a matter of like intention. So, yeah.
Joanne, do you have anything you want to add to that?
If I could add, there's another key word that dropped in the conversation is equity, and how we define equity. I'll first give my interpretation of equity, what it means to me. In my opinion, I believe that equity should include recognition of our communities. And what I mean by recognition is taking into account the historical context. So for example, here, when we think about the US, you know, the long-lasting impact of segregation, what has it led Black communities to date? You know, if we look at Overtown, if we look at the environmental structure of that community, you know, the community is pretty much drowning around highways. And in a state like the state of Florida, especially down in South Florida, where we're dealing with extreme heat, what does it mean to communities that are surrounded by arteries that are utilizing like heavy traffic that rely on fossil fuel? So on the one hand, there's an impact on the quality of the air that those individuals are breathing, but there's also a noise pollution in addition to the increase in temperature. So recognizing those impact that has been placed on those communities, the stress that it's generating, and also acknowledging that for too long, these communities have been left out of the critical conversation that should take place around the impact that we're facing as a result of the climate crisis. The second element that I think should be addressed is also the process that we've been following. And when I say we, I'm generalizing. So when we think about policy decision-making processes, who are the stakeholders who are constantly at the table, and who are decisions being made for, as opposed to who are decisions being made with? And I think it's really important that we reflect back on what that space has looked like up to now and what need to be changed in that context. And the last one I think goes back to distribution. We always think about distribution as, and I'll use like hurricane relief or response as an example, distribution being, oh, this neighborhood is flooded, we need to evacuate individuals, or we need to bring food to that neighborhood. Distribution should not only be limited to access to resources, but it should also be expanded or inclusive of the sharing of lived experiences, culture, so that whenever we are at that point of making decisions that might lead to change in policy, that it reflects those communities who've been excluded of that space. So that's what I wanted to add from the equity lens.
So one of the things that is coming out so clearly is that that just recovery really is going to touch on every aspect in a lot of ways of the lives of the frontline communities here in Florida, just because of the way that the climate crisis is unfolding and the historical context of the environmental injustices that have already occurred and continue to occur. So one of the things that I'm curious about is, you know, over the course of the work that you've been doing, what has been the most surprising, and I don't necessarily mean that in a positive context, way in which you've seen this play out, you know, whether it's through, you know, some kind of environmental issue, whether it's some kind of extractive economy-based issue. What are the ways in which, you know, you've seen this play out that maybe some of the people that are watching don't, may not necessarily be aware of? Does that question make sense?
I see Naomi thinking really hard, so I can try to take the first step at that. So first, I would say when, and I'm answering in the context of a disaster, it is clear that communities have their own level of social cohesion and social network. And when it comes to that time to support one another in during hard times, they step up to the plate. I think what's missing is that bridge that can connect and build that relationship between communities. And when I say communities, I'm talking about all communities, whether it be the Black community, Brown community, Indigenous communities. At the end of the day, we're all being impacted by climate. Unfortunately, we're not being impacted at the same extent by the climate crisis, but we are impacted by the climate crisis. So one thing, in my opinion, that is needed is identifying how do we build that bridge that can connect all of us, in across communities in the state of Florida, and communities also including those who are in a position to move resources from one community to another or bring resources into a community that never had access to that resource. So that's the distribution. Under the recognition aspect is how can we support and promote recognition of emerging leaders in communities, recognition of those practices, appreciation and acknowledgement of those practices that each community has used for so long, for centuries, as a way to survive when facing disasters. And redefining what stakeholder means. I think when we think about policy, when we think about legislation, when we think about regulations, oftentimes stakeholders might be seen as, just organizations and those who are pushing policy. But a key player who is missed out of the space and for whom space has not been created to be part of are your average constituents, your citizens, because they are the one who truly know what's happening at the hyperlocal level. They know what's happening in their block. They live those daily stresses, whether we're talking about gun violence, whether we're talking about pollution from landfill sites, whether we're talking about extreme heat and having to be an hourly wage worker working outdoor as a landscaper or a farm worker. Those individuals should be recognized, and space must be created for them not only to be at the table, but to also have their experiences and recommendation valued in that space.
I have to think about that one. But I think that what's been most shocking to me is sometimes the lack of urgency that is present in regarding conversations as far as like what are things that could be dealt with previous to the idea of hurricane season, or whether it be the fact that it rains all the time and our streets are always flooded. We know that we have issues with the drainage systems. We know that we have issues with the lack of green spaces. We know that we have issues with access to proper education and information as far as like what is climate, how it impacts, and having access for everybody in these spaces, especially the people that are most impacted, because full transparency, the frontline communities, the communities that are in the hood, the ones that are struggling the most are going to be the ones that are hit the hardest. They're not going to be able to cover the cost of being able to be present for all of these instances, hence the COVID-19 vaccine and how hard it hit the Black community and how hard it hit the Latinx community. So that sense of urgency, I think that another issue too is just the fact that like communities are painted sort of as monoliths, and we need to be very, very aware of how communities have developed, even if it's like individualized. It is still not the same experience. Migrational patterns matter. The reasons why people are here matter. The way that they sort of like adapted to their community and the role that they play is significant. And it definitely all comes out when everybody's on the table talking about how do we move on from whichever context it is that we're speaking of. Yeah.
That's awesome. So there are a few big pieces to how we can talk about this conversation about just recovery. The first is community engagement, the relationship building, the educational piece that can be part of that as well. The contextualization, the hyper local understanding of each of these communities. Then there's the land piece, the physical and environmental dynamics that are present in each community. And then there's the resource management piece. What is it that these communities need, and how can we step in or step out in some ways to make those resources flow better to where they need to go first. So we had a question in the chat from Gabby, and her question was, what can we do better to ensure BIPOC communities are provided resources not only to recover, but to prepare for disasters such as hurricanes?
When are they present in that conversation? That's the first question. Are they present once it happened, or are they present from the start? Because if people are there from the entirety of the process, then you will know what are the needs that need to be met. And it's not a matter of just sitting there. It's a matter of, if they are speaking, are they being paid attention to? Do things move if they speak? Does it make a difference if they're in the room or not? Or are they just there for the picture? So really making sure that it's a proactive space where it's really taken into consideration, and it's not just something that's performative, because everything else just spills out on its own.
Yeah, as soon as you asked the question, my first reaction was, where are they part of the conversation? And that's where the recognition comes from when we talk about equity. Yeah, so I have nothing. I think Naomi hit it straight to the point.
So then my follow-up question to that is, because you guys are in two different areas. Joanne, you're in South Florida. Naomi, you were in South Florida. Now you're here in Central Florida because we managed to attract you away from Miami. So my question is, hey, can everybody make sure that you are on mute, please? Thank you so much. So my next question then is, so you have organizations in each of these regions who are already doing this work. You have communities that are already doing this work. What is the kind of movement that you're seeing in these areas? What are the kinds of conversations that people in these two regions are currently working in just recovery?
I feel like Joanne's the person to answer that question, because she's the one that runs those spaces. So I'm gonna just like.
Okay, I'll start, and I hope you can finish it up for me, Naomi. So in the context of just looking at the pandemic, when it first started or hit the state of Florida, organizations throughout the state have come together to have conversations around what does it mean for the communities we are working with, what are the risks, and what kind of push or what kind of advocacy initiatives should we consider. So in terms of what I've seen is the acknowledgement of the implications of the pandemic and what it meant for the communities that each organization work with. And in those spaces, for example, when we think about our farm workers, the fact that, we still needed to have food on the table. And had it not been for those farm workers, we would have not had access to those precious resources. So I think that's something on the one hand, making sure that we not only raise the concerns around how, like, the risk that those communities were facing, but I think it also calls for us to take some time and appreciate the contribution of the frontline workers during this pandemic. Now, I think an opportunity or an area that requires a lot of work, there's so much that organizations and communities can do to fully respond and recover from a disaster. And I think that's the reason why other players, whether it be from the local government or state government, have their piece of the puzzle to bring to that space, and finding strategies and opportunities to build those bridges so that every key player in that space can play their role while appreciating the contribution of each group of stakeholders. And stakeholders, I'm also including communities, whether it be from the Black community, Indigenous community, whether it be from the community of individuals with disabilities, which is oftentimes left out of the conversation. So making sure that they are present in that space, that everyone's idea, experiences gets taken into account in any strategic planning or response effort. Otherwise, it's going to be an unbalanced foundation. And if we have an unbalanced foundation, we can't really move ahead. So in terms of like difference from between South Florida and Central Florida, I think the approach that I can bring is what it has looked like with us working with grassroots organization, working with communities across the state. We always step up to the plate, and we always reach out to communities and engage, collaborate with communities. But I think there is an opportunity for us to have a more holistic and equitable approach when it comes to planning and responding. And that would fall under a just recovery framework.
Yes, I want to add to that farm worker lens that we have organizations like Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the Farm Worker Association of Florida, and We Count that were essentially being targeted because they were the ones that were holding up the idea that farm workers were essential workers and they deserve the security and the safety of being vaccinated and having the ability to have testing sites. And they had to fight tooth and nail to get crumbs from the administrations that are currently in office. So I think that the things that I'm seeing in my spaces is a deviation, along with the work that's being done as far as policy and structural change and the communal sort of outreach. There's a very high emphasis on the process of humanizing the people that are being impacted the most, because it is very easy to cut resources if you do not see them to your level. And when we talk about undocumented folks, when we talk about people that are not from here, when we talk about people that, because added to the lens of immigration is every other identity, sexuality, class, race, ability. Again, it's one of those things where it's like we are impacted, but we are not impacted the same. So if we know that there are already a lot of gaps in addressing our issues, we're going to fill them in from the start. And there's a very high presence of mutual aid. There's a very high presence of direct sort of like pressure and making sure that we are covering our bases, whether or not we have the support. So I think that's also one of the good things that when we talked about before, the idea of like, what is the most surprising? It's right back to what Joanne was saying about people stepping up to the plate, and really taking matter into their own hands and really questioning, what are these institutions doing for us, including the nonprofits, because the nonprofits are part of the nonprofit industrial complex. And we have to talk about, how much work can we actually get done when we are being measured by metrics, and those metrics are being set by grants, and who is writing that grant. So yes, there is space for the work in the org, and also when we clock out, we're still working, which is also not good for the organizer, but we're working on that. So it's recognizing the different opportunities that we have in the spaces that we're sitting in, and trying to maximize that the most, and seeing what we can do, and being honest about what we can't, but how do we work towards that?
I could add one more thing, Elizabeth. So to your last point, Naomi, what can we do and what can we not do? If we look back at previous disasters, oftentimes, depending on the scale of that disaster, you may have a response team coming from out of state. If we're talking about another country, it could be like an ask to other countries to step in and come and respond following a disaster. But oftentimes we tend to miss out on community members, because when we think about the first 36, 70, 72 hours, they are the first responders to their communities. So why not value that skill set that already exists in the neighborhood that is being impacted, or on the territory that is being impacted. And if I were to create like a model, I would say, if we consider hourly wage workers who have to lose their next paycheck because of an incoming hurricane, why can't they be trained and hired as temporary first responders to their communities? Like that, it helps with it lowers the financial burden on those families who oftentimes cannot even afford buying food for a few days, to survive the first critical hours of a disaster. And oftentimes who may have to relocate because they cannot afford paying high insurance premium for their homes, or they cannot live in the apartment because it got demolished or destroyed as a result of a heavy storm. So why aren't we looking into a more sustainable approach when it comes to disaster planning or management, especially when we're thinking about the response or the first critical hours that follow right after an impact?
So let's talk a little bit more. And Naomi, I saw your thing in the chat, but we have a little time. So can we talk a little bit more about asset mapping versus extractive economy post-disaster? Because I think that there are, that's the way that I do my job. I asset map. I see what resources are within the communities that I'm working in, and then I work with that. But also, Naomi, you were saying earlier, we want to make sure that we're not extracting from communities that are feeling trauma after a disaster. So, and Joanne, that's not what I'm saying that you're saying, but I do want to maybe draw that connection and that divide more clearly, since we do have a little extra time. If either one of you want to speak a little bit on that.
I think it's a matter of intention, because I was on a call recently, and the idea of disaster capitalism, which is essentially, it's literally like a straight up post-apocalyptic, like people doing these jobs that they're not trained for. That's exactly what the whole anecdote was about. Undocumented person was basically working out here in the country in one of the disaster sites, fell off the roof, went into a coma. That was it, you know? So if we are giving the opportunity for people to earn their money that way, they need to have the choice whether or not to do so. And that's done by previously setting a livable wage, you know, because if people are pinching pennies and then that's the only way that they can make ends meet, that's not a choice. That's survival. And, you know, are they being tended to when they get out of that natural disaster scene? Because when you're knocking on doors and you smell that smell and you know what's in that house and you're about to open that door and see what's up, somebody needs to talk to you after that. You can't just go home and not debrief that. So are there the proper resources for individuals to have a proper quality of life, have a proper idea of well-being while still dealing with these things? I feel, and hence why the trauma with the word resiliency, it's a lot of the times it's survival. And we are just jumping from situation to situation, along with the fact that we're just going from paycheck to paycheck to paycheck. And is there, oh, there's a question. But yeah, I think it's really just a matter of intention. And again, understanding that the influx of people coming in and out of the state, understanding those dynamics, and where are the people that, you know, do not have readily access to these services. How is that structure going to be set up? But because there are people that are willing to help. I'm one that I'm always ready to go into the fire. You know what I'm saying? So, but I have a livable wage. That's not the choice for everyone. They need to go and check on their neighbor because their neighbor is either in a wheelchair, they're older, they don't have the resources, they don't even know if they're going to make it to the door. And that's the only reason why they're doing it, and there's nobody else to do it. And not doing it is not an option. So how can we provide more options so that it's an authentic, true, this is what I want to do choice, and not, shoot, there's nobody else to do it, so it might as well be me.
And you know, to add on to Naomi's comment on how can we provide options, I think it's also important to understand and learn what role each organization, grassroots organization, play in the community where that they are serving. So, for example, when we think about language access, you know, if we have organization that primarily serves the Haitian community, how do we collaborate with those organizations so that we can have a better outreach and engagement with the Haitian community? If we know that there's a community that's only speaks traditional Chinese and it's not clear how to engage or address or find out what some of the immediate needs are in those communities, who are some of the gatekeepers, whether it be churches or other grassroots organization, how do we engage with them to not only understand the culture, the approach towards a possible solution, or using a holistic approach to generate a solution to address those issues. So I think like that's something else that needs to be recognized as well.
Awesome. So we have had a couple of really good questions come in through the chat. So the first one that I'm going to do is from Wendy. They're both kind of related. But hers is, she asked, is there a formal or informal advisory body in Florida composed of vulnerable communities, i.e. people of color, frontline communities? Oh, my scroll went up. That helps to inform emergency management efforts? If not, is it possible for one to be created?
I can partly answer that question. So I know that several organizations, they have their particular way of engaging with the communities that they're serving. So for example, here at Florida Rising, we do have a climate justice steering committee, and that committee is made up of community members only. And the goal of that space is to not only share our lived experiences, but to also understand what are emerging urgencies that are coming from whatever representation or whichever area, geographical area in the state of Florida is present in that space. We also have organizations like the Miami Climate Alliance, Central Florida Climate Action, who are well engaged with their communities. So they have the closest understanding of or awareness of what's happening in those communities. So I would say those are spaces where organizations and community members are engaged, and also that space is diverse as well.
And I don't know necessarily if Wendy meant this or if this is just what I was thinking when I read it as well. But if we're talking about government level emergency management, so at the local and state level, are there, do we have advisory boards made up primarily of frontline community members that have been, tapped intentionally by, our elected officials in order to be able to more adequately represent what disasters actually look like in these communities? I can say for myself, I am not familiar with them, but you guys have been doing this work here in Florida longer than I have.
I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see it. And according to your organization, you have more or less access to these elected officials because of the dynamics of what these organizations stand for. So it would be cool to have it, but it is definitely a game of how fast can those strings be pulled in order to get into those meetings and then therefore get some things going. And also that climate should be in everybody's radar. However, this is also within a context that it's like a attention and numbers game as far as like which topic will be getting dealt with. Instead of dealing with it intersectionally, it's dealt with isolated. So that's added on to the dynamic as well. But a clear answer, I don't see that. At least I don't see that. But where we're sitting at, it might look different from another area where we don't look like, but no, I don't know. Ooh, girl.
Can I have a minute, Elizabeth, to add something else? So I would say there has been initiatives on the organizational side to try to create that space that would bring communities and local representatives. So for example, there's the Florida Disaster Resilience Initiative, which is intended to create those space to have conversations with communities so that challenges from past experiences with hurricanes, for example, are brought to the table, and recommended solutions generated or proposed by the community are also discussed. Then those solutions are presented to their county emergency manager. So for example, we are currently working on a round of meetings in Osceola, Orange, and Seminole counties. Now, this is just like the first step in what the ideal environment needs to be, because we want to have that environment where everyone is present, everyone is engaged, and it's this circular loop as opposed to being an extractive model. Down here in Miami-Dade County, we were able to work with the County Emergency Management Office, where we now have the opportunity to share that community liaison seat at the EOCD Emergency Operations Center. And this gives us the opportunity to have someone from the community share that seat and also create that space where we can share information with the community when appropriate, and also make the county aware of what's happening at the community level when there is a disaster. So I would say there are like mini steps that has happened, but we can do better. And I would say like many groups like need to step up to the plate to really flesh out that concept.
So our next question is going to kind of transition us into the final section of this panel. And it has to do with our engagement, or individual engagement in these issues at the local level. And we've talked several times about the need and the importance of direct community engagement. You have to actually be in the communities and be building relationships in order to understand the issues that are present and the best solutions for them. So the first question that has to do with this is about local policy. And the question is, and since we're halfway statewide, bi-regional, I guess if we can call it that, what local policy, if any, already exists should we advocate for related to equity in disaster response?
You can go ahead, Joanne.
I think the first step is really simple: recognition. We still do not have that space where the diversity of community we have in the state of Florida, for the diversity of communities in Florida to be present in that space. We do not have that representation. So recognizing this lack, and also proactively creating that space so that they can be part of the conversation. The communities that we work with, we as an grassroots organization that we work with, can be part of the conversation. And that's a heavy lift, I would say. That's the biggest rock, in my opinion.
Yeah. Chaos, hold on. Added on to that, because representation and it being taken into consideration is important, but also the tone policing of how communities show up and who in the community is supposed to show up. Because respectability politics is a thing. And again, communities are not monoliths. So it's being able to have literally everybody. Because there's a very sanitized version of who is supposed to carry out these things, and also how transparently they should be about what their material conditions are, their quality of life is. Did you say the second question or not yet?
The one about advisory bodies.
Oh no, I think I girl, this fever's got me. Okay, we gotta let's do the next question or whatever's happening. Hold on.
So Naomi got her second COVID shot today, so she has graciously given of her time to be here, and thankfully she's hydrating, which I'm sure Joanne is very proud of her for that. So actually, this is one of the ways that I just kind of want to tie this up in a little bow, is to put some resources in the chat. So so Joanne mentioned the Disaster Resilience Initiative. I am the Central Florida lead on that initiative, and so this is actually my job. And so I am happy to be the kind of gatekeeper for people who want to interact with Joanne and Naomi, because they are much more interesting and knowledgeable than I am. So I am going to put my email in the chat. There are a whole host of ways that different organizations that are already doing this work, different communities that are already engaging in these conversations. So, over and above emailing me, it's worth hammering it home one more time. You have to actually have conversations in these communities. You have to build relationships in frontline communities to be able to understand the dynamics of just recovery, and what we can actually achieve with equitable resilience, and the solutions to all of the historical and current ongoing issues. That's my little tie-up. Joanne, Naomi, do y'all have any way to kind of put a cute little bow?
Sure. Added on to that, this is what I was thinking, but Pfizer got me. Political education is something that you cannot put a price on. Like, it is literally our one, if not one of our most important tools, because it bridges those gaps and it really allows people to practice radical imagination. We're not just meant to be surviving all the time. If we don't have a moment to really sit, digest, and sort of like spit out like what is our ideal scenario, it's just not going to happen. So really providing the spaces and creating opportunities to have conversations, and doing so in creative ways, because we don't always got to be suffering, we got to have a party sometime. We have to really make sure that those spaces are there and that they're seen equally as legitimate as all of the other work that is happening, because that and self-care, we really can't move.
And I oftentimes like to use sport analogy when talking about how we come together in this space. If we talk about an American football team, you can't have like a good line of defense if you don't have the ideal coach. And the team cannot win if every player, whether it be the quarterback, your offensive, I'm not really great with terms, but the different groups that make up the American football team. If everyone does not have a clear communication plan, if everyone is not fully invested in the goal of winning, then you're setting up yourself for failure. And I think that goes back with the same way how we interact and connect and relate and collaborate, whether it be at the county level, whether it be at the district level, whether it be at the state level. So, those in a position to change policy, like legislators or organizations who have like close relationship and trust with communities, community members, all of us need to be at the table, and we need to be proactive and intentional with regards to creating that space for those conversations to happen, but also for that change to happen. And lastly, I did not mention it when we first started with the conversation. I really want to thank the Miami Climate Alliance, the Central Florida Climate Action, and all those who've made this Climate Justice Summit possible, to have us be part of this conversation. I truly appreciate it.
You stole my line, because that was going to be my final thank you, but it's worth echoing again. Thank you to all of my wonderful colleagues at Central Florida Climate Action, our amazing colleagues down in Miami Climate Alliance, and the incredible people who made up the planning team for this summit over the course of this week. And I just want to give a special shout out to Jillian and Jeanette for just being incredibly awesome and making everything run smoothly. They make all of us look good. So we will give you back the rest of your evening, but we want to thank you for being here tonight. And we will welcome you back in this space tomorrow. We will be talking about energy democracy, and we invite you to come back, because that's going to be a fantastic conversation as well. So on behalf of myself, MCA, CFCA, thank you, Joanne and Naomi, for being here, and for Chaos for being our honorary panelist. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.